Rogue's team slowly made their way through a wide-open, rolling landscape filled with grass, flowers, and a beautiful flora of exotic insects that flitted about lightly on the wind like a patchwork of multicolored light. Just above them was the disaster-class Arch Pixie, Lilith, who floated lightly on the air as though she weighed nothing, despite her size. "So what's the mission this time?" asked Kite. "From what the guild request said, it's a discovery mission. We're to explore some kind of lost ruin and search it for traps. The guild wants us to do that before they send any official archaeologists in there to research it, as they don't want anyone getting hurt," said Rogue. Rod looked up at Lilith, who floated above them, and then down at the others. "So, is that why we got the sky tank with us today?" he asked. Lilith, realizing that he was talking about her, spun around and glared down at him. However, he paid no attention to this. Lilith looked briefly at Rogue before looking back at Rod. "I'm hardly the strongest here," she said flatly. Rod grinned. "He's the walking disaster. You're just the sky tank," he teased. She smirked incredulously at this, but said nothing as she turned around again and faced forward. The team soon reached the edge of the ruins where they briefly surveyed it before carefully entering. Thankfully, to their combined relief, despite the rumors of what might happen, nothing did. They then descended down a set of rugged stairs into the ruins, and soon encountered a large room beneath the building from which spread off 4 different tunnels. "Should we split up, or stay together?" asked Rod eventually. "I say we stay together. There's no telling what we might find around here," said Kite. Rogue, wanting to explore as much of the ruin as possible, decided that they would split up, but it would be him doing the splitting. "Roku, Rika, Lilith, go east, west, and south," he said. A moment later, Roku and Rika appeared and went down the east and west passageways respectively, as commanded, while Lilith went into the south passage. Given how strong each of them were, he wasn't worried if they stumbled onto anything dangerous. Eventually, they returned and reported that every one of the tunnels was a dead end and not worth exploring. "You sure they didn't have hidden passages?" asked Rogue. The 3 of them nodded. "They're just dead ends and solid walls. There's nothing more to report," said Roku. "So north it is then?" asked Rod. "North it is," nodded Rogue. The team then proceeded forward into the northern passage and walked for a short ways as they cautiously watched for traps. However, to their great relief, they found nothing. Moving further, they stepped into a small room that appeared empty and had only one exit leading away from it. But before they could get any further, the floor beneath them began to rumble and crack. Immediately, everyone rushed for the walls to get away from the center of the room. However, Rod wasn't fast enough and fell through the floor with a scream. But before he could fall far, Lilith immediately flew downwards and grabbed him, just inches from floor that was filled with deadly spikes. Rod looked down at them in fear and horror, and then up at Lilith with great gratitude. "Stupid idiot, watch where you're walking," barked Lilith. However, despite her scolding, Rod was grateful for her saving his life. "Thank you. I really appreciate you catching me like that," he said in reply. Lilith looked at him sternly, but then blushed slightly in gratitude. "You're welcome," she said with a hint of shyness. The 2 of them then floated back up into the room above them as Roku and Rika immediately closed the floor behind them and reinforced it. Lilith then set Rod down on the floor and looked at him both sternly and yet with a hint of kindness. "Don't lower your guard again. I won't save you next time," she scolded. "Yes, ma'am," said Rod with a grin. Lilith again blushed slightly before turning away her gaze and hardening her expression. Rod grinned at this. The team then proceeded forward through the door on the other side, around a bend, and into another room. However, as they did, a sense of dark foreboding hit the team. Detecting this as well, Lilith flew deeper into the room, immediately triggering a series of traps that sent out a flurry of arrows, poison darts, and other dangerous things. But like the Arch Pixie that she was, she easily deflected the attack. Unfortunately, in doing so, just like her master, she overdid it and completely blew the lid off the room, opening it out into the sunlight above with deceptive ease. Seeing her mistake, she slapped her hand onto her face in an expression of self-chastisement. "Aw, crap. I overdid it again," she muttered. Roku and Rika looked at this with furrowed brows, but said nothing. However, the others had a chuckle out of this. "Wow, Rogue. Even your summons are scary," chided Sarah. "Yeah, tell me about it," replied Boyari. Rogue, however, merely grinned at this in reply. The team then walked into the now-cleared room and looked up at the massive hole that had once been its ceiling and marveled at the level of damage that had been done. "Man, that's definitely some rogue-level destruction right there," chided Boyari. "I know," replied Emma. Lilith blushed in shame at this. "Sorry," she replied. Sarah smiled. "Yep, she's definitely a little chip off the old rogue," she chuckled. The team then continued forward through the winding passageways of the underground complex until it exited out near a broken-down fountain. Now back on the surface, Rod looked around the area and was puzzled why they'd come out here. He then realized that they hadn't seen this part of the ruin when they'd first arrived. "So, where exactly are we?" he asked. Rogue and the others looked around briefly, but didn't recognize any of it. "I don't know," said Rogue curiously. He then motioned towards the Arch Pixie, nodded towards the sky, and said, "Lilith, give me an overwatch." Lilith nodded in return, thrust her wings down hard, and exploded into the sky. However, she had no more than climbed about 20 feet when her head slammed hard into an invisible ceiling made of granite. She floated down slightly, eyes closed tightly in pain, and swore loudly. She then looked up at the illusionary sky, and the hole her head had smashed into the super hard granite of the ceiling as she swore again. "What moron put an illusionary ceiling in this place?" she said angrily. Rod, wanting to get a better view of this, walked over to the broken fountain and climbed up the statue that was in the middle of it. However, just as he reached the top, a group of large ballistas appeared through a series of nearby windows and fired large, heavy bolts in his direction. Detecting this, Lilith immediately raced down from the ceiling at thunderous speed and reached Rod just in time to block the gigantic arrow bolts that had been flung at him. Seeing that she had successfully saved him, including stopping the one bolt that had gotten past her defenses, she nodded lightly at him. He, in turn, looked over in shock at the tip of the large, rusty, terrifying ballista that hung just inches from his face. He then took his finger and gently pushed it away. Lilith grinned at this and casually threw it away. Not long after this, she turned slightly to reveal that she had absorbed, in her back and wings, all of the other bolts that had been fired at him. Rod was floored by this, but also even more grateful than before. Lilith then gave a gentle shake of her body, dislodging the ballistas and causing them to rattle to the floor harmlessly. After this, she turned towards the windows from which the bolts had come and fired a series of energy blasts into them that destroyed all the others that were hidden there, completely rendering the area safe for future exploration. Seeing that it was now safe, she turned her attention back to Rod. "Don't let it happen again," she said with a hint of stern reprimand. Rod nodded gratefully. "I'll do my best, ma'am," he said politely. She then grinned lightly before lifting him by his collar from the statue and floating him gently down to the ground. After watching all of this unfold, Rogue clapped lightly in appreciation. "Well done, Lilith," he said. She blushed ever so slightly at this. "Thank you, Master," she replied. Mesa looked around the area with curiosity for several moments before turning her attention to the ceiling above. "So we're still in the complex then, I take it?" she eventually asked. "It would seem that way," replied Rogue as he too looked up at the ceiling. Mesa, deciding to test things out, drew an arrow, briefly enchanted it, and then fired it into the ceiling. However, what happened next was not what she'd expected. Upon striking the ceiling, the arrow immediately caused the illusion across it to collapse, plunging the entire room into darkness. The others all blinked slightly at this as they looked around the darkness in surprise. "Well, that was unexpected," replied Mesa. "High noon," said Rogue as he cast a light spell that filled the room. This immediately lit up everything there as bright as daylight, revealing the now bare ceiling and surrounding walls. All that remained to be seen anymore was the fountain, the holes in the wall where the ballistas had been, and the door they came out of. So all of that was an ancient magical illusion, said Kite in wonder. Yeah, magical and kinda broken now, replied Rod. Mesa, upon hearing this, glared at him. Hey, don't blame me. Nobody said that a magic arrow would break anything, she barked. Boyari snarked slightly at this. I think Lilith's head did more damage to it than your arrow did, he chided. Lilith, however, glared at him. Hey, don't blame me. They're the ones who made it so perfect that even I couldn't detect the illusion, she protested. Rogue raised his hand and said, But I could. And you didn't tell me? Screamed Lilith. I thought you already knew, replied Rogue flatly. Lilith screwed up her face in an expression of exasperated frustration as she glared angrily at him for several moments before finally face-palming, grunting, and then storming away in frustration. Rogue, however, merely grinned at this. Meanwhile, as this was going on, the others in the team looked around the now mostly empty room in perplexity. It looks like we've hit a dead end to me, said Boyari in frustration. Well, we may have and may not. Let's find out first before we completely give up on this path, said Kite. He then held out his hand and cast Ping. A moment later, a greenish wave of energy erupted out of his body, spread out across the room, and then bounced around like ripples in a pond. After a few moments, he perked up and pointed to a nearby wall. Over there. It's a hidden door, he said. He then threw a marker at the location he discovered for everyone to see. I got this, replied Rod excitedly. However, Lilith immediately picked him up by the nape of his collar and held him in place. Not this time. You don't, she said sternly. Rod looked at her in both fear and confusion. What? I was just going to open the door, he replied. Yeah, and probably get yourself killed too. You big idiot, she retorted. Rod, deciding that it was best not to argue, agreed to stay put, after which she put him down, but still remained close by his side. Rika, open it up, said Rogue. Rika nodded lightly at this, walked over to the door, and then gave it a gentle push. Well, if you can call it gentle, as his simple, light push caused the hidden door to explode inward into another tunnel, triggering half a dozen traps on the other side in the process. Lilith, who still remained by Rod's side, quietly watched this with interest. And that is why it was best to leave things like this to the stronger fighters, she said. Rod nodded. Yes, ma'am, he replied in amazement. Lilith smiled lightly at this. Eventually, after ensuring that everything was clear, the team continued on through the tunnel, down several flights of stairs, and into a large, circular chamber filled with ancient treasures and rare artifacts of all shapes and kinds. Whoa, jackpot, said Kite in amazement. I think this is going to make the archaeological department really happy, said Boyari. I believe it will. However, we need to continue exploring until we've exposed every crack and crevice, trap, and otherwise in this place. Only then will our mission be complete. Rika, take point. Roku, take middle. Lilith, take up the rear. Let's proceed a bit more cautiously from now on until we're certain that there are no more surprises, said Rogue. The others all agreed, and then proceeded forward, with Lilith watching over Rod and the others from the rear. However, as she did, making extra certain that they all stayed safe, she looked down at the plucky young Rod and again smiled slightly. As much of a pain as he was, she was starting to like him. Or, if nothing less, he was giving her more than ample opportunities to be a good, quality, and useful protector for the team, and she liked that. She just wished Rod didn't always go out of his way like he did to help her achieve that. The team then continued on for a ways further before coming to a room that looked like a cross between a battle arena and a torture chamber. Wow, what psychopath thought this was a good idea, said Mesa in shock. Rogue looked around the room and then pointed at the desiccated corpse of a minotaur. Probably him. Either that or his boss, said Rogue. Emma, upon seeing this, blinked slightly. Wow, talk about dedication to the job, she replied in mild disgust. Rod laughed. With what we've seen so far this place, he probably got trapped down here and couldn't get out, he replied. Hopefully the same doesn't happen to us, said Kite. Boyari snorted. Unlikely. We're walking around with 4 overpowered tanks. If we get stuck, at least one of them will just blow a hole in the ceiling and get us out of here, he laughed. Yes, wanton destruction by our favorite guild members, chided Rod. However, Lilith glared at him for this. Hey, the ceiling issue was an accident because my boss forgot to properly inform me of what was above my head, she retorted. Yeah, and it was your head that discovered it too, laughed Boyari. Lilith tisked lightly at this. Yes, unfortunately, she muttered. Rogue, however, merely shrugged apologetically. The team then continued on for a ways before they walked into a massive room that was adorned like a royal audience chamber, complete with a man who was sitting on a throne at the far end. Flanking him on both sides were rows upon rows of armored suits that stood at attention. But what made this reveal shocking wasn't the rich and expensive treatment of the room itself, but the fact that everyone in it was a dead, desiccated corpse surrounded by rot and decay that gave off the aura of a horror game. Call me crazy, but I'm starting to think that this place is less a ruin and more of a tomb of some eccentric, egotistical king, said Rod in muted horror. Yeah, either that or it's a bad remake of Dagger Hill from the 2280s, replied Boyari. Rogue furrowed his brow slightly at this. Maybe so, but it still makes a really good archaeological site. Either way, we should probably wrap up our expedition at this point and return to the guild, he said. This drew a deep, almost playful smirk from Lilith. You're not wanting to leave already because you're scared, are you? She teased darkly. Rogue returned her jest in kind with a look of muted incredulity. If I was scared of this place, I would have leveled it already, he retorted. Oh, self-burn, laughed Rod. This drew laughter from the others as well. Even so, the laughter didn't last very long before everything settled down again into muted anxiety. Still, even though what we found has told us a lot, if we are to properly complete this quest, we will be best to continue on until we have ensured that it is safe for others to come in here. After all, there's no reason to turn this into a real horror game because we didn't do our job, replied Kite. The others all thought about this briefly and then looked at Rogue. As much as I would like to agree with him, I think we should just level the place and pretend it doesn't exist, said Rod nervously. Rogue, however, looking a little wounded at this, huffed lightly, with mock indignity. No, we have a mission to complete. So, even though it's a bit unnerving, we should still complete it to the best of our ability. Anything less is dishonest, he said. He then turned and moved deeper into the room. As he did, the others all looked at him, briefly with silent, confused glances before breaking out in roaring laughter. Rogue scared of the grave cave, teased Rod playfully. I am not, protested Rogue. This caused the others to all laugh even harder. This, in turn, greatly lightened the mood, making the rest of their exploration less stressful and more fun, just like it should be.